produce such wonderful 5 children that they have contributed so much to the world and to the society. Our dear Dr. Milani left Iran when he was just 15 years of age to continue his education. He attended University of California at Berkeley and received his bachelor's degree in political science and economics in 1970. Subsequently, he went to Hawaii and received his PhD in political science in 1974. If my math is correct, he was just 26 years old when he received his PhD and decided to return to Iran to begin his academic and teaching career. He taught at various universities in Iran, some of which are National University of Iran, at the Iranian Center for Social Research, and at the Faculty of Law and Political Science at Tehran University. Dr. Milani was also a member of the Board of Directors at Tehran University Center for International Studies. Unfortunately, because of his political views, he was arrested and imprisoned for 1 year. But he later wrote the account and experience of this period of time in his book titled Tales of Two Cities, a Persian Memoir. This wonderful, well-deserved biographical account later became the bestseller in 1997. Since 1988 to present time, he has been active at several universities in Northern California. He is professor and chair of Department of History and Political Science at Notre Dame de Namur University in Belmont, California, where his wife, Dr. Jean Nyland, my dear friend and colleague, is chair of Department of Psychology. Dr. Milani is also a research fellow at the Institute of International Studies Center for the Middle Eastern Studies at University of California, Berkeley. Recently, Dr. Milani has joined the Hoover Institution at Stanford University as a research fellow. Dr. Milani is the author of 6 books: Rethinking Persian Modernity, Persian Sphinx, امیر عباس هویدا، یعنی Persian is the معمای هویدا، Modernity and its foes in Iran, Tales of Two Cities, a Persian Memoir, Our Democracy and Socialization, Mehregan and the Tragic Vision. I'm going through this very fast and I apologize. He sent me a book for a resume of all of the lectures he has given and the monograph he has translated. He has translated 11 books into Persian. And for one thing, and he has over 40 scholarly articles that he has written and a number of short stories. He has written over 150 book reviews alone for the San Francisco Chronicle and is a regular guest on BBC. We have seen his face on CNN. He interviews with Voice of America and is a member of several very large professional societies. He's also recipient of several awards, amongst which are Eisenhower Library Research Grant, John Kennedy Library Research Grant, and he was selected as the Professor of the Year and a person of teaching excellence. I have to tell you that recently some of us were invited to a gathering at a friend's house in Los Angeles where professors from Stanford University and Hoover Institution, which is a prominent research institution at the best university in the world, in my opinion, Stanford University, came with Dr. Milani, and they said, we prize this man so much, well, we honor him so much, that we would like to see a chair of Iranian studies be created at the Stanford University focusing on modern Iranian culture and politics. This is the first time a chair is going to be created anywhere that is going to focus on modern Iranian culture and politics. And you know, all of us stood taller when we heard this, that we have somebody like Dr. Milani amongst us, that he's going to be doing such thing. He's going to be sponsoring a conference during the month of November at Stanford University with the participation of 20 prominent scholars from all over the world to discuss Iranian culture and politics, and probably the proceeding of which will be published both in Persian and English. It's my honor to present to you this afternoon Dr. Abbas Milani.
Thank you very much. It is my honor, my very distinct honor, to be with you today, this afternoon, over the last 2 days. I honestly believe that we are part of a very historic event, in the sense that I have been searching my mind and I've been asking my friends whether there has ever been in the Iranian community's now 25-year history in diaspora, ever a meeting of this sort, where this large of a gathering has come to hear from a varieties of views, none of which have a political agenda behind them, and none of which are good singers. This rare combination and the fact that so many of you kindly participated, I think will enter the history of Iranians in diaspora as the beginning of a beautiful friendship, as they say in Casablanca. What I'm going to talk about is rethinking Persian modernity and the concept of Persian, the concept of freedom in Persia. And in some ways, I think some of what I have to say is has a slightly different take than some of the material you have heard from my very dear friend, for example, Professor Karimi Hakkak, or from Professor Afshar. I have a slightly different take on the way we need to approach our tradition and the way we need to approach our culture and what the results of this new approach would be. There has been for many, many centuries, I think, in fact, from the first time that a Westerner knowingly wrote about Iran, there has been this concept that Iran presents something fundamentally different than the West, that there's something unique about the East, and meaning Iran, and that there are some rather irreconcilable conflicts between them. The first extensive account of the history of the West, which is in a book called Histories by Herodotus, is in fact an account of Athens' wars with Iran. And Herodotus there makes very clear that Western consciousness of itself as a civilization, as something distinct from the other, and that other being Iran, develops as a result of its encounter with Iran. So Iran has played a very crucial role in the development of Western consciousness, and I'm going to give you other instances where we have had a very, very significant influence, an influence that I think by and large we can be proud of. We don't necessarily have everything to be proud of in our history, but the way we have influenced the West is indeed something we can be very, very proud of, and I'm going to give you some instances. And in that account, Herodotus says that there are lots of things that are different between us and these others. He calls us barbarians, but he doesn't mean barbarians in a traditional sense that we now understand it. Barbarian to them meant anyone who doesn't speak Greek. Identity was defined essentially by language And anyone who didn't speak English babbled to them and was something like a babbling barbarian. And he talks about the things that are different between Greeks and us, Iranians. And he said Iranians, first of all, have an infinite curiosity about the world. We have heard often said that Iranians don't pursue science, that science is the purview of the West, that the notion of discovering the world is a monopoly of the West. But the West, when it first began to become conscious of itself and cognizant of the other, in Herodotus, says the exact opposite. He says Persians are great discoverers. Persians have an enormous, infinite curiosity about the world. Persians have mapped all the rivers and waters of the world. Persians, and this is the time of Herodotus, this is 2,600 years before today, began to dig what would later become the Suez Canal. All of this is in Herodotus. He also says that Persians have a very unusual way of ruling themselves, and he calls that the monarchical system that we have, the kingship that we have. Now today, kingship is much in disarray as an institution, as in a historic retreat, essentially. There are very few of them left. But at the time of Herodotus, and later in the writings of Aristotle and Plato, they talk about this model as something potentially an ideal. Aristotle says, if you can find yourself a good king, kingship is the best system in the world. But it's also the worst system in the world, because if you get the wrong king, you are in deep trouble. If you get Shah Sultan Hussein, you get Muhammad Baqir Majlisi with them. But if you get someone like Kurosh, for example, you might have a lot of good things happen to your country, as in fact it did, of course, unless you read Mr. Khalkhali, who thinks Kurosh was well, you know what he thinks of this. It's not worth repeating here. Anyway, he also says that one very important difference that Persians have from us, and I think this very much relates to the question of freedom, is that for Persians, their gods are abstractions that live in skies. For us Greeks, gods live amongst us. Greeks at the time, in the earliest phases of their history, believed that their gods are amongst them. And this could easily explain some of the problems, some of the tradition of despotism that it begins to evolve later in the Iranian history, in the Persian history. There is one other important difference that he mentions, of course, and that's Persians don't eat figs. There is one figs, anjir. One time, one of the kings goes to a soothsayer and says, should I attack Iran or not? And the soothsayer says, no, don't attack Iran. He says, why? He says, well, it's one of two cases. If you defeat them, they're going to learn how to eat figs, and there will be less of them for us to eat. And if they defeat you, you will be in deep trouble, and we don't want to do that. So at that time, we were spared the attack of the Greeks because we didn't have a taste for figs. Now, from that time all the way to the 20th century, we have had a series of thinkers who have told us that Iran is fundamentally different than the West. In the 20th century, for example, one of the most articulate manifestations of this can be found in a very brief essay in the introduction of a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Max Weber writes that modernity, rationalism, freedom, democracy, the idea of thinking about the world in a rational, symmetrical way, all of these are Western in origin. They have been developed by the West, and they are completely estranged to the East. From this emerges a very important consequence. From this emerges the consequence that if Iran wants to be modern, if Iranian writers, for example, want to become modern, if Iran wants to be a modern political structure, the only way they have is to emulate the Western experience. All that is scientific, according to this model, all that is rational, according to this model, has developed in the West. The East has developed one thing and one thing alone, and that's religion. All the major religions of the world in early antiquity were developed in the East. Now, in the 19th century, we have the evolution of Babism and Baha'ism in Iran and the evolution of the Mormon religion in America, and both of them become world phenomena. In between that early period and this later phase, we have no other religion that becomes a world movement. And this leads Max Weber to conclude that the Easterners, particularly, are good at developing religion. We, the Westerners, he says, develop science. I find this idea to be historically questionable. I don't think it's necessarily true. I think it is often tinged with a little bit of racism. I certainly think it is part of the colonial game because the attitude of the West in terms of denigrating the Iranians and the East in general changes radically in the 19th century with the advent of colonialism. If you read earlier histories that the Westerners have themselves written about the world, you would clearly see that in earlier times, before this white man's burden became part of the motto of the West, before the West decided that it had to liberate the world, they were far more willing to admit the contributions that other civilizations have made to the evolution of world culture and world civilization. Herodotus, again, is an interesting case in point. Herodotus says, and this is almost an exact quote, he says, there is more civilization and culture in one room of the old Egypt that we conquered than in all of the West. One room in Egypt has everything and more than all the West has developed. This is the way the West thought about it. Come 1500 forward, read Shakespeare, read Antony and Cleopatra. In Antony and Cleopatra, there is a description of Egypt, and the friend of Antony is trying to describe why Antony fell in love with Cleopatra. And part of the reason he seems to have fallen in love with Cleopatra is the grandeur that is Egypt, the glories of Egypt. Now, fast forward 400 years, and you have British colonialists who go to Egypt and think that they have to civilize Iran. In 15th century, Shakespeare is filled again with wonderful allusions to Iran. Iran for Shakespeare is a land of plenty, is a land of affluence, that is a land of good taste, is a land of culture. Fast forward 500 years, read the letters of Sir Bullard, England's ambassador to Iran during 1937 to 1946. It reeks of colonialism. Sometimes you want to tear the paper that you read it. The way these bastards talk about Iran as a backward culture, the way they talk about Iranians as a primitive people, as shady, crooked people, has nothing to do with what they themselves used to write about us 500 years earlier. What has happened, our history hasn't changed. What has happened is that colonialism has come, and now they see the world differently and they define it accordingly. Now, several reasons, several factors worked hand in hand to make this view that modernity is Western, that all that is scientific, all that is good has come from the West. And if we want to become modern, we have to shed all that is Persian, all that is Iranian. That famous phrase by Taqizadeh, Iranians have to change in their bone and blood, their skin everything, all that is Persian, and take on the attire and the culture and civilization of the West. Taqizadeh himself later changes this, apologizes many times, but it becomes sort of emblematic of a vision that sees Iran as essentially a second-class category of civilization. Now, the factors that worked to contribute to the prevalence of this view, I think, are at least fourfold. There are four factors that I can come up with. First and foremost, of course, is the propaganda of the West. Since 19th century, the West has been on water time. But unfortunately, I can't have water because there's no cup. But that's all right. The first factor, of course, has been Western propaganda. From textbooks to films, look at the way they depict Iranians in films, look at the way they depict Easterners in films, in cartoons, in fairy tales, in Aladdin, for example. The list goes on. One great scholar has called this view, this jaundiced, one-sided, racist view, Orientalism. This scholar's name is Edward Said. He's written a very famous book. It's called Orientalism. And he says, and he's not talking about Iran, incidentally. He's usually talking about the Muslims in general. Said himself is a little bit, because he's Palestinian, he sometimes falls in line with the Orientalists and talks about Persians in a negative way, but I think he can be forgiven for that. But in general, he calls this Orientalism. In other words, it is a colonial view of Iran, a view that does not want to give Iran credit where credit is due. In fact, in reverse, it tries to portray us as a corrupt, incapable people who have contributed nothing, who are parasites. I mean, these are some of the words that are literally in the British documents. In one case, it says Persians are nothing but a bunch of parasitic carpet merchants. This is Bollard talking about a culture that has produced Hafiz, has produced Ibn Sina. Thank you very much. Now we need a phone. Ring. The second group that has helped foster this idea is a category of people that Fakhreddin Shadman, who Dr. Karimi Haqqaq referred to, refers to in his book, the book that he referred to, Taskhir Tamaddun Farang. And to be honest with you, I have to say that I'm advertising for my own uncle. He's my own uncle, my uncle Shadman. But he is, I think, he has contributed much to this discussion, and his role has not been duly appreciated. And the reason I think is very clear is because he became part of the Zahedi cabinet, and intellectuals never forgave him for that. And in Iran, intellectual discourse, intellectual discussions is always tainted by politics. People intellectuals are elevated, and those they don't like are thrown to the garbage bin of history, or at least they try to throw them in the garbage bin of history. This group of intellectuals that Shadman calls Foucaults, later Al-Ahmad, in a much mutilated way, he refers to them as Gharb-Zadegan. These are intellectuals who, according to Shadman, know very little of the West, and even less about Iran, and become champions of the West and say Iran has to become fully Western, and all that is good has come from the West, and all that is from us is degenerate and bankrupt. The third group of people who have contributed to this Western attitude about where modern ideas come from are Iranian Marxists. It's a very strange fate. In a sense, Iranian Marxists have bought into this view that capitalism and contacts with the West ideas that we call democracy, all of these things came as a result of the first encounters with the West. First during Safavid, for example, and then during the 19th century. You read many, for example, a book on the origins of Iranian novel. When does an Iranian novel begin? Mr. Christophe Balayi, who is a scholar, French scholar, says novels begin in Iran when Iran begins to contact the West. Well, some of us think that that's not necessarily true, that Iran had a tradition of fiction writing, had a tradition that can contribute to fiction that precedes the West. Not everything begins when the first Westerners came to Iran. So Marxists, from an entirely different perspective from the Foucault's, contributed to the same. The fourth group, I think, is the most interesting group. The fourth group that has been persistent in saying that modernity is a Western phenomenon and has come from the West are the enemies of modernity in Iran, most specifically the mullahs. For 150 years, and in fact you could go much back, further back, and we will talk about how Iran essentially has had 3 attempts to become modern, and at all 3 times the greatest enemy to this modernity were the clergy. At all 3 times, the greatest foes of modernity in Iran were the clergy, because, and if you don't like modernity, this is not a negative thing to say about them. If you ask Ayatollah Khomeini, he would very openly tell you that, yes, we are the enemies of modernity. In fact, he says so in his book. In his Kashf al-Asrar, he says, he doesn't talk modernity per se, but he says these things, the rule of law, freedom, Congress, all of these are colonial ideas, and we are not going to allow it. Schools, secular schools, are colonial ideas, we're not going to allow it. So mullahs, because they have been enemies of modernity, have also fostered the idea that modernity is Western. And in that sense, the idea has taken the almost prevalence of gospel. Everyone thinks that that is the truth and there is no other truth. I think if we look back at our own tradition, we will find a different story. But before I tell you about that tradition, one important consequence of this notion that modernity is Western has been that in the last 100 years, every time someone has fought for freedom in Iran, every time someone has said that we want secularism, and every time someone has said we want equality for women, and every time someone has tried to say there should be a separation of church and state, every time somebody has come up with a new idea in the religious field, the first mark they have on him is the mark that this is part of a colonial hegemony, part of a colonial trick. Women who say there should be a freedom to select what you want to wear in the street, they are advocates of the West. They are Arbzadeh. They are fighting for American imperialism. People who in the 1900s fought for constitutionalism were directly said to be enemies of, advocates of British colonialism. There are many people who still believe, there might be some amongst you here, that argue that the constitutional revolution was essentially made by the British. Why? Because any attempt at freedom has been, over the last 150 years, made to be suspect, to be part of the colonial game. My point is that that is a misreading of our past. We need to research our past. And I think if we do this, if we begin to reread our tradition, and if we begin to reread it from a new perspective, and I'll try to explain what that perspective is, we will realize that contrary to the claims that has now become gospel, Iran had an attempt at modernity long before modernity came to the West. between the 9th and the 12th century. I have tried to make this argument at some length in the book called Tajaddud va Tajaddud Sitizi dar Iran, and I'm trying to make the same argument in another book that is coming out in English in a few weeks, I think. My argument is, and I'm not sure that I'm right, but I'm suggesting it, and I know some people in this audience would probably disagree with me. Professor Karimiya Haqqaq might have some disagreement with some parts of it, some agreements with parts of it. Professor Afshar, the same thing. Professor Milani, the same thing. Professor Holakui, the same thing. But all of these people that I mentioned are precisely the category of people who I think are, for the first time in the history of Iran, capable of offering this new reading. We need to read the past from a new light, which is at once Iranian and global. In other words, we need someone who is not awed by Shakespeare or by Melville and is not ignorant of Hafiz or Sadi. Someone who is at home in both of these fields. Someone who knows recent theories of criticism, but can also read and write in Persian, is comfortable with Shahnameh, can read Shahnameh as well as Professor Haqqaq read Shahnameh for you. I kept hearing my friends complimenting him on his rendition of these poems. Someone who can do that and at the same time argue from the latest theories of the West. This combination, this kind of a view that is Iranian and global, that is not too enamored of Iran, who doesn't think that all that is good is Iran, that there is nothing wrong in our past. No, there is plenty for which we have to be ashamed of. There is a whole history for which we have to apologize. We have to apologize to a lot of minorities. We have to apologize to women. We have to apologize to religious minorities for all that has been done to them and are being done to them. Yet, we have also a lot to be proud of. Someone who can say both of these things and also know both the advantages and the disadvantages of the West. That kind of a perspective that is available in the people that I mentioned and is increasingly made available amongst a category of intellectuals, is going to allow us to reread our culture, and it's going to be a difficult process for reasons that I've tried to explain, and come up with a new reading of our own past. If we do this, my hypothesis is that we will come to the conclusion that there was a modernity in Iran before there was a modernity in the West. In fact, some of the ideas that we call modern went to the West from Iran. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There are many examples of ideas we think quintessentially Western, quintessentially rational, that were in fact far more developed in 11th century Iran than they were in 11th century Europe. In fact, Europe learned these things, and I'll give you some examples, precisely as a result of the Crusades. With the Crusades, they came to the East. They expected to find a desolate land because they thought they were Christians, they were the children of God, and everyone else was an infidel. Instead, they found a very thriving culture. They found a culture that in many ways was far more superior to them. That's why they took, even in the Eastern Christianity, they found something that was far superior to the West. That's why they took half of Constantinople and rebuilt Venice with it. Half of the buildings, half is an exaggeration, but many of the most beautiful buildings in Venice have been literally uplifted from the East and brought to the West. That kind of a bringing back is far more extensive than what you find in Venice. Now, one of the main problems facing this new generation, and again, if you look back on the 3-4 generations of Iranian modernists of the past, they have usually have one of these two qualifications. The first generation, for example, the people who began experiencing the West wanted to completely estrange themselves from their own tradition, leave behind tradition. Iran has nothing to offer for a modernist. That was the argument of the first generation. The second generation, some of the people in the second generation who began to publish some of the texts of our past, people like Firuzanfar, people like Qazvini, people like Henri Corbin, these people were laughed at by Iranian modernist intellectuals. Sadiq Hedayat wrote one of his most cruel short stories about Firuzanfar for no other reason than Firuzanfar didn't know Kafka probably. Of course, they say there was also a reason that they didn't let Hedayat come to the university, but the way he attacks Firuzanfar, calling Firuzanfar someone who does nothing but naqsh qabr, becomes a motto of a whole generation of Iranians who don't know their tradition and are willing to learn a French poem, learn Russian history, learn American history much more than they would learn Persian history or a Persian poem. Then you have a third category of people who knew the West all too well or all too little, as the case may be, but had very little contact with Iran. They didn't want to do anything with Iran. We have people in Iran writing today, as we speak, write about modernity as if he is in Germany. There is nothing about Iran in this book. I read it, and I can't believe that someone who is in Iran is so completely strange from his surrounding, from his context. The context is Iran. Now, this generation that I gave you some examples of, I think are going to be pioneers in rereading this past. Now, one problem is that much of our past is not available to us. Let me give you a couple of interesting, at least were interesting for me, anecdotal evidence for it. In 1959, the Shah goes to Vatican for a visit. There are two reasons given for why he went, and I tried to get the Vatican archives to open their files to me so I could find out what the real reason was, and I found out that the Vatican archives are much more difficult to get into than even the British archives. The British archives have a 35-year limit. The Vatican archives have a 75-year limit. Now, the theory is that the Shah went there to get annulment for his first marriage so that he could marry the daughter of Emmanuel. There was a princess the Shah was interested in, and that part is for sure. There is no doubt about that. And the Pope apparently says no, because he says the Shah has been married once before, and a good Catholic girl can't marry someone who's divorced, unless the divorce is annulled. Some say he went for that, some say he just went because he wanted to visit the Pope. I don't know which one is the truth. The Pope gives him a gift, or he gives him a couple of gifts. One of them, of course, is the Pope's own picture. The return, of course, in return, Shah gives him the standard Persian gift at the time, a Persian carpet. And the second gift that he gives, I was fascinated by, is a 3-volume bibliography of original Persian and Arabic and Turkish texts, unpublished manuscripts in the Vatican Library. There is a 3-volume bibliography of it. A few years later, I was talking to a friend of mine. His name is George Saliba. He is a professor at Columbia University, and his work is in medieval sciences. He calls it Arabic sciences. I call it Iranian Islamic sciences, because many of the people he writes about are actually Persians. They wrote in Arabic, so he calls them Arabs. Now, he told me, he asked me whether I knew someone in Qom. I said, why Qom? He says, in one of the schools, one of the Ayatollah's schools, there were 3 main libraries in Qom. This was the smaller one. He says there are 5,000 manuscripts that are still not even annotated, not even chronicled. I want to find out whether there is someone who can tell me what these texts are. In other words, there is an abundance of texts that are about our past that are yet not published. Hafez, our greatest poet, had his first complete editions in 20th century. Sa'di, the same way. Bayhaqi, the same way. Many of these were originally published, found by Westerners. It is only the last 40 years that some people have begun to publish annotated, correct, scholarly editions of some of these books. Tariq Bayhaqi, about which I will talk a little bit, is one of the greatest books in history. But of its 30 volumes, we only have 1/30 of it left. 29 volumes is gone. We don't know where it is. And the list goes on. So unless these books are published, are annotated, and are analyzed from a new perspective, from this kind of a global Iranian perspective, not from a perspective that already has assumed that Iran has nothing to contribute to the world, I think we will come away from this reading thinking that we have had a much, much greater role in shaping Western consciousness and in shaping modernity, in creating modernity than has hitherto been agreed to. Now, if you follow the path of the West, I gave you some examples about Herodotus. This is the beginning of Western consciousness. The next step, major step, in the development of Western consciousness is the emergence of a man named Saint Augustine. At the time, his name was Augustine. Later on, he was beatified. He was called saint. I strongly urge you to read, if you get a chance, his Confessions. Confessions of Augustine is one of the great classics. It's one of those 50 books that we always think that every college student must read before they get out of college. It's one of the great books. And it's a very beautifully written book. It's a very good read. He talks about how he came to Christianity and how, because he was born into a family where his father was an absolute gambling infidel who made fun of Christians. He was in 4th century, and he was born in where today is Algeria. His father was an absolute heretic. His mother was a very devout Christian who wanted his son to become a mullah. Her dream was for her son to become a priest. And for the first 18, 20 years of his life, Augustine was a very reckless young man. He had many affairs. He lived with a woman with whom he was not married. He had a child with her. He gambled. He stole things, as he explains in his confession, the famous peach that he steals. And then he has a conversion and becomes Christian. There he talks about how ideas about Zoroastrianism, ideas from Mani, the tradition of Mani, ideas from the Mithraic religion had infiltrated all the way to Algeria. And he says that I became a Zoroastrian Manichaean before I gave it up and became a Christian again. Now, many people say that what he developed into Christianity, what became the Augustinian Catholic Christian ideology, is very much indebted, very, very much indebted to Persian traditions, to Iranian traditions of Zarathustra, to Iranian traditions of Mani, to Mithraic religions. Again, there is another book. If you think that I'm Persian exaggerating about the virtues of Iran, I suggest you read a book by Bloom, Water Time. Mr. Holakouee has a lot of criticism for him, but I am very grateful. It gives me a chance to. Many people think that the bulk of the Christian Catholic ideology, in fact, comes from this tradition. And one of the books that, again, I suggest, if you get a chance, read, is a book by Harold Bloom. It's called Omens of Millennium. He wrote this when everybody was worried about 2000, where the computers are going to crash and what's going to happen in the 2,000-year cycle or the 1,000-year cycle. And he picked up all the themes that in that culture were Persian in origin. And he says this sort of hysteria is really the revival of Zoroastrianism. It's got nothing to do with Christianity. There he talks about all the ideas in Christianity that come from Persian traditions, from the idea of a millennium, to the idea of a devil, to the idea of angels, to the idea of a resurrection of the body. All of these, Bloom argues, come from that tradition. The next major moment in Western consciousness, I refer to the Renaissance a little bit. I don't want, because of a shortage of time, go back to it. The next important moment of consciousness in the West is, of course, 19th century. The West has now become the big bully on the block. And I gave you one version of how the West views Iran. That's the colonial version. But there is another side to Western consciousness of Iran in 19th century. This can be found, for example, in the writings of people like Emerson. Emerson is said to be the quintessent American intellectual. He is said to be the embodiment of American intellectual ideology. And when you read Emerson, he says, the book that impacted me, the book that in terms of its wisdom is on par with the Bible, is Sa'di's Golestan. And he read Sa'di in translation. Read Melville, the great American novel, the writer of the great American novel, Moby Dick. You've all heard the name Moby Dick. If you haven't read the book, I'm sure you have all had a sandwich made by Moby Dick, or a chilo kebab in the Washington made by Moby Dick. But before it was a sandwich shop, Moby Dick was a book. And it was a very interesting book about Captain Ahab, and you read it, and the liberating ideology in this book, the liberating passion of this book is Persian, very clearly. And it is the Persian Zoroastrian ideology that is fighting this corrupt Western Christianity that Melville wants to overthrow, essentially. The whole movement of transcendental literature in 19th century, late 19th century America is directly influenced by Persian culture. Now, some of this is not necessarily a good influence, because by the late 19th century, you have the translation of Khayyam. And Khayyam, the great poet of the jug of wine and the loaf of bread, is the only version of Khayyam that they offer. In other words, the Romantics were